script of the Gospel of John tomorrow, wherein Jesus says, God is greater than I am.
When Dan states here that the book of John wouldn't change anything, well, to a degree he's right, because monarchical Trinitarianism actually accounts for Jesus being equal to, but also subordinate to the Father. It wasn't just explained away. It's coming out of Judaism, actually, with exegetical technique before it ever hits philosophy. And with the work of people like Larry Hurtado and plenty others, and this whole entire line of scholarship that's opened up in places like the Jewish and Christian Text and Context, that series they have here, where you also have Andrei Orlov talking about this. You have New Vistas in Christian and Jewish scholarship. You can't really just say that the Bible here and these manuscripts that show up much later are just referencing something that's been changed so much. You don't know, but we can actually place with the paraphrase model that they were keeping it in keeping with the theology we can see in the iconography of the time, the liturgical fragments, and this type of theology that's coming out of the two power schism on the side that the rabbis end up rejecting. So you can't really say that this is just something they made up and explained away, or that it even has to be completely equal, because it's actually accounted for in the original theology long before, as you know, Fiana would say that this is just, and there's three powers in heaven, that this is just a discursive intellectual movement. It has that aspect to it, but the Jews were already using philosophy when they were talking about these things. Boyarin has his thesis that a lot of the Midrash and a lot of the Talmud is actually something like a Platonic dialogue. When in his Socrates and the Fat Rabbis, we see Philo using philosophical language. We can look in the wisdom text, and there's probably mimetic exchange going on between Persia, between the Hellenic world, between Egypt and the Jews. So to really to sit here and say this was just something that showed up in philosophy much later on, that doesn't even hold water, really. And when you see people critiquing Bart Ehrman and some of the things he admits about the veracity of these texts, even though he rejects our position, and Siegel does too, they are holding up that this is a valid branch that came out of Judaism. And it's actually coming out of there before they move into this. And you can see all the way up into like St. Basil, Gregory of Palamas. For centuries, we're actually holding on to a theology that says, yes, the Son is equal to the Father in essence, but he is also subordinate to him. And this is something super logical in reciprocity. So this is actually a straw man position. It's partly, there's some validity in what Dan McClellan is saying here, because in the West, the Catholics basically reduced this into absolute divine simplicity and turned it into a logic problem where it's basically subject to human, binary logic. In that sense, they sort of put their conception of God on the platter for you people. But if you're looking at the original position while you're trying to talk about it, like it was something that was just made up and explained away later, that's complete garbage. Siegel also, he rejects the Christian position in his Two Powers book as a rabbinic Jew, but he still puts out the plausibility of it being a valid strain. So Boyarin talks about that. He's a bit of an ecumenist. He also backs this Three Powers position too, because he doesn't like the way Christianity defined itself against Judaism, because he doesn't like boundaries. He's a bit progressive, but he will still uphold that the real debate was between rabbis and Cappadochian fathers. So this little oversimplification that you guys are running with, as though nobody came up with this idea until the 3rd century, until 900 years later, it was all changed, is really garbage. And a lot of the differences in these texts are like minor spelling differences. And we can see what they believed in the Didache, because we don't hold to the position of sola scriptura. We don't care that there's some errors in the Bible. We don't hold a sola scriptura position. We believe in a tradition that was in the living covenant with God, and that this came from the Old Testament into the New Testament when the Old Covenant was annulled and modified, which is God's right. Even within many Jews, they believe God has that right. They just don't accept Jesus. They don't accept the temporality and spiritual dimension of the annulment of the fulfillment of the prophecies and the fulfillment of the Levit in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, even though many of them did think that was a danger of annulling the Old Covenant. Some of them believe the Zionists are in danger of having the covenant annulled right now. They do believe that is a right of God. They just don't accept Jesus Christ, this carpenter who was in front of them, as the Messiah. In Rabbinic Judaism, whose ideas are upheld as though they are the very same as they were at the Second Temple period, systematized itself in another direction. So this kind of game that's played to present this to the general public and play off the popular mind and all this stuff like ancient secrets of the Bible, the Bart Ehrman, thousands and thousands of errors in the manuscripts, is what you guys are playing off of to act like the Trinity wasn't there at all because you don't like the validity of the theology, because it actually gives a position that you can't just dismiss away as some kind of a mistake or an error. A bunch of stupid people don't know that the Trinity was made up far, far, far later. It's there in the Didache. It's there in the symbols of the Ark. Larry Hurtado has gone through a lot of this. There are other scholars too. I mean, this kind of idea that there wasn't a proto-Trinity before the word is even used, or that it's not in the Gospels with things like in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, in the name of the Holy Spirit. It doesn't say that to come in God's name is different than having the name in him or being baptized in the name. I mean, these are clear references to the Trinity and the objects in there, not just in the Gospel of John. So this kind of case you're making here is bunk, the all or nothing totality, that there was nothing there. To say we would accept that further systematization goes on. That when Siegel says that the Christians kind of end up with some of the same problems that the rabbis had, where people start arguing over this and it causes some fragmentation, and then further systematization has to happen to delineate the errors. Well, that's true, but you can't just say these are all just subjective and it's negotiated as whatever anybody wants it to be. It has to follow a coherent line of logic. And anything outside of that line of logic, the implicit theology from the explicit exegesis, is actually ruled out as wrong because it's wrong, not just because it's what anybody wants it to be and they just negotiated what they wanted it to be. To think that people sacrifice themselves to this, which is another thing you're leaving out, because this wasn't just a written philosophical tradition. We just have the texts of the people who wrote, because that's what stood the test of time and gave a defense of the faith and defeat of other belief systems and refutation of them. A lot of what they refuted were many views that are very similar to your views, from the skeptics, the atomists, against the heathen with Athanasius, against many of these heresies. And against the Jews, they've actually refuted a lot of, when Athanasius is arguing against the atomists, when they argue against the Epicureans. These discussions were already had, and they can be very easily adopted and plugged into today, and also integrate truths in other religions, integrate truths in other philosophies. You could see Dyer doing this when he uses his version of tag and integrates elements of Kant after we refute certain elements. We could look at what we see as bad philosophy in Nietzsche or postmodernism, but say that they are good at having descriptions, not proscriptions, but descriptions of certain problems here in modernity. And I think this is a strong evidence of the truth in this system. And to say that this was just something that was nothing but an intellectual movement, I think that's completely ridiculous, and you're overlooking the original exegesis and the continuity here, and asserting nothing but multivocality. Of course there's multivocality, of course there's polemics, of course there is rhetoric involved. But it's not all that there is. So that's one. Number two, what the original point I was just about to make is that this wasn't just about the people who were writing these books. I mean, you could see, I just pretty much explained why they were so important, writing these letters. But it's not the only thing that was going on. There was also many people who were, spreading this stuff through iconography, and people who were spreading it by oral tradition, which is a part of our tradition. There were many saints who were probably low IQ and didn't write anything, but they were a big part of this theology and participation. There was tacit knowledge involved in here. If you're going to go over and do cognitive science of the Bible, why are we not allowed to bring up the participation in the cognition that goes on in religious practice? Or the fact that we have many things that people are fleeing the West for, to the Far East, meditation and things like this, or discernment of religious practices, while everybody devolves into New Age nonsense or crazy woke vitalism. So I don't think that this is completely justified, the game you're playing, to just annul everything and reduce it to, none of this stuff came along until hundreds of years later, so we don't know what they believed. I think you can look at the paraphrase model too and place some of these gospels much earlier and think and realize that they actually believed Jesus was God, and they believed in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit long before they talked about the word Trinity. So this is complete nonsense that's just been pushed into the popular mind, and you're basically playing off it on its last dying, breaths. because there's a lot of scholarship within your own view that doesn't even agree with it.